Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Fischer. I'm a part-time graduate student here at Villanova pursuing a master's in theater. I serve as the dramaturg on this production of The Scar Test, which is being produced by the Villanova Theater Department. I'm really excited to be here with you three today to talk about the play and about the state of immigration here in the US. While our play is set in the UK, I do hope our discussion today will illuminate some commonalities in the trials immigrants go through. So let's start out with some introductions. Michele, can you tell us about yourself, about your work here at Villanova as a professor in the law department and with the Claire's Clinic?
I am a professor in the law school, and I've been teaching at Villanova for 20 years. 20 years ago, I started a clinic for asylum, refugee, and immigrant services, which we refer to as CARES. And in that clinic, over the last 20 years, law students and I have provided free legal representation to immigrants, including families and individuals who are held in detention in Pennsylvania, in the Burke's Family Shelter, and also in York County Jail. And then over the last few years, I've been developing a new educational program to train immigrant advocates who are non-lawyers who can provide legal representation to immigrants in immigration court and before the Department of Homeland Security. So it's a huge project, and I'm really excited. It's a course that's offered through the College of Professional Studies as an online certificate program.
Sounds fantastic. And I mean, you've been doing this work for a long time. What initially drew you to working with immigrants?
So I actually took my first asylum case when I was a junior associate at a big law firm in New York City working on corporate transactions. And I think I was drawn to immigration and asylum as a way to kind of connect with an individual person. I was working on a lot of big cases, most of which were corporate deals. And doing a case in asylum gave me direct impact on an individual. And my first case, I was hooked. My first client was a young Somali man who had fled Somalia with his father. His father was also my client. He had been a clan leader in Somalia, and they had fled at the beginning of the war because Aidid was intending to kill my client's father. And so just kind of learning the story and getting to know them and meeting people like individuals and being able to like literally save their lives was life changing.
Amazing.
And then over the years, more and more people from their family came, and I was always called on to do. So over the course of a few years, I must have represented like 7 people from this particular family.
Love
They
it.
were all very lucky to have you on their
Yeah.
side, I bet. Well, thanks so much for sharing that about yourself, Michele. Margaret, let's jump over to you. Can you tell us about yourself, your work at the
Sure.
Nationality Service Center, all that good stuff?
Absolutely, Kate. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. Really, really. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself because, in watching the production, you'll understand a little bit more later, but some of it resonated with me a bit. So I'm executive director of the Nationality Services Center. We'll be celebrating 100 years of welcoming immigrants and refugees to Philadelphia next year. So look out for all the good stuff that's coming out of that because we're already planning for that. I'm the 7th of 10 children born to Irish immigrants who were born in Ireland under home rule, but before Irish independence. So and I also had done an internship with the NHS in London. So I know a lot about, I know a lot about England. Let's just put it that way, from different angles and Commonwealth countries and such. And I previously, my jobs previous to NSC, I mostly worked with the Red Cross in Philadelphia as the chief program officer and interim CEO, and did a lot of humanitarian work in Bosnia and Armenia and Romania and places like that. Bosnia was in particular after the war, and all of that in addition to a stint with the Clinton Foundation, led me to NSC, right? And so now we're in a world where we're not only living in a world on fire right now, all the crises going on around the world, causing people to seek asylum, but also, the issue of climate refugees. Everything in my career is all coming together in a way that I guess is good for me, but not so good for the world. Meaning that, they're the issues that I care about a lot, and they're all starting to converge. So NSC, just very briefly, we serve about 5,000 people a year. We are the largest refugee resettlement program in Philadelphia. We're expanding out to Norristown, and we have a very strong relationship with Villanova, and particularly with the nursing school, and with Caitlin Barry. And I'm guessing she's related to the group that you're associated with, Michele. And I guess more than anything, what makes me so proud to be here tonight is just recognizing that through a recent program with the Vera Institute, NSC and some other providers got together some money from the city of Philadelphia to provide universal representation to those that were detained at Berks in New York, and that, pushing for universal civil Gideon, and making sure that these folks had a voice. So as Michele will tell you, that's not necessarily their right. And we're part of a national effort now to make sure that legal counsel is available to them. So I'm really excited to be here for all those reasons.
I mean, again, all those folks are very lucky to have your expertise there to protect them and help them feel safe and like they are allowed to be here. Which exactly. That's the hard part of the work. So I would love to do a quick intro for Claire as well, and then we're gonna dive right into talking about the play. So Claire, our director, our fearless director, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up coming to direct the SCAR test?
Yeah, hi, my name is Claire Moyer. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a freelance theater director in the Philadelphia area. I also work as the associate director and literary manager at Inishnua Theater, which is in Center City. We produce new plays from the UK and Ireland. And oddly enough, I wear a third hat, which is that when I'm not directing, working in theater, I actually work for a social services nonprofit. So my relationship with Philadelphia and nonprofits and in Philadelphia expands definitely beyond the arts. But as far as this show and coming to Villanova, Villanova actually has a pretty substantial history with Inishnua Theater as well. And my main relationship with Villanova is that we do a reading series each year at Inishnua on a specific subject. And we work with Villanova master's students as dramaturgs on it. So I have gotten to know the Villanova program quite well, mentored a number of dramaturgs, see them, had really excellent experiences and built a relationship, particularly with Chelsea Phillips, who heads that program, and have been really impressed at the quality of research and work that these students have brought forward. And we sort of dive into a subject. So last year, the subject was about stories of people starting families, and the year before was about aging. We did a series on immigration. And in my work in theater, Margaret and I have actually interacted before because I previously directed a beautiful play called The Swallowing Dark by Lizzie Nunnery that told the story of a Zimbabwean asylum seeker in the UK and is based on interviews with asylum seekers. And so have kind of through that learned a lot about the British asylum system. And then when Villanova approached me about this play, it made a lot of sense, both because of my knowledge of just British Irish theater in general, but also the sort of beforehand knowledge of having worked on a play that stylistically could not be more different, but thematically sort of resonates both from a what's happening in the UK and Ireland, but also what's happening in the US. And I know we're going to dive into that a little bit more, but in both cases, these plays, while being, you know, products of the artists that created them in the context they created them, reflect a lot on our country and culture as well.
Yeah, with that in mind, Michele and Margaret, I would love to hear your thoughts about what resonated in the production for you when you went, oh, that's like here, or oh, we don't do that here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I actually didn't see much that didn't resonate with the experience in immigration detention in the United States. I mean, one thing I could say is that in some of the detention centers that I've worked in, our clients have had to wear uniforms. And so that was one thing that kind of also, like, another layer of dehumanization, in that no one can even wear their own clothes and everyone needs to kind of look the same. But I feel like there were a lot of things that resonated from the way that the prison guards really wanted to depersonalize the detainees, and a few times said, don't do that, or don't make this hard for us. I thought that was that captured so much of what I've seen with a lot of the prison guards, from, you know, the lack of respect and the lack of privacy. I mean, there's all the layers, I think, for me, resonated a lot.
How about for you, Margaret?
You know, so much resonated with me, but I'll start with one of the more subtle aspects of what I saw, which is really hit home for me. If you notice, when they brought in, they call it translation, it's really interpretation. When they brought in interpreters through the phone, there was this very strange dynamic that was happening, right? So in one case, the interpreter was kind of, you know, basically telling one of the detainees, just be quiet about it. You choose to love in another way, but just keep it on the down low, and everything will be fine. And that is so exactly how it happens with us when we're on the phone with, like, I won't mention the company, but I've been in interviews and also just using interpretation to try to help people get their story out. And I've heard people that, again, they speak their language, they're often from the same country, chastise them for what they're saying, what their story is. So here they are just trying to tell their story. It's a very subtle thing, but it's actually very powerful if you think about the way that was worked in there, because no one is listening. And then when you even try to get that interpreter to, like, tell the story for you, they're judging you, or they're telling you that your feelings aren't legit, right? Or so it's very, that was one of the first things that hit me. It was like, yeah, I've experienced that. I've had an interpreter tell me, well, conversely, an interpreter told me what a good job I was doing with the client. It's like, okay, thank you. We're just paying you to interpret. You don't need to, value judge here, or to the positive or negative. But it's a subtle thing, but it matters in this story, because this is about your story being heard, not being heard, not being seen. And so I thought that was a very interesting technique that was used.
I think that's an interesting thing that you picked up on, Margaret, because I feel like even the systems in place within the system that are supposed to be helping the individuals in need of help are still fallible, potentially problematic, and complicated, right? Like, there's no step in it where it's like, oh, this is the straightforward bit, this is the easy part. And every hurdle that each of these characters face is way more complicated than it probably should be. But, like, even then, they even understand when that interaction starts.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I really connected also with the interpretation. I mean, when you go to immigration detention and you have to work with an interpreter just to be able to speak to a client,
right,
And in law, language is basically our tool, right? Words are our tool. And so when you can't communicate effectively with a client, it impacts the whole attorney-client relationship. And it's just more hurdles to that ability, like you said, um, Claire, like how something so simple as just talking with somebody else becomes so complicated. And then imagine if you have a client who speaks a language that you don't have ready access to an interpreter. Like when we first in our clinic at Villanova, the beginning of the Iraq War, we had a lot of clients who were Chaldean Catholics and they
Mhm.
spoke Chaldean, and there were no Chaldeans in the whole Philadelphia area. What we finally found a not-for-profit organization in Michigan, and that organization, the secretary of the organization became our interpreter.
Oh,
So
that's great.
go out to Berks. So
Yeah.
we're in a detention center, in a room, meeting with our client. We have a phone, and this woman is like taking time out of her day to help interpret so that we can have a basic conversation with a client.
Yeah. The other thing that if I could just add, is I guess another part of what resonated with me is, know, you're 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 hearing the the conversations about, they're intimating the detainees are intimating that something's happened. You're piecing things together in your head. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. No one's telling you what country they're from, right? So you're not allowed to draw any conclusions. Well, they're from X, so of course that would have happened, right? And in some regards, it brings us all to this universality of like, bad things happen to this person. They were leading an otherwise, maybe good life, maybe not so good life, but some some trauma, some tragic event happened. It doesn't matter where they're from. This is a human story. Um, and I do want to say that what was interesting for me is, and I think a lot about this, and I'm I feel comfortable sharing this with a Villanova crowd, because I know the Irish are such a big part of the Villanova story. But again, my parents were from Ireland. My parents came here. My mom came by way of England. She studied to be a nun there after she left Ireland, but changed her mind, came here, met an Irishman, had 10 kids. And my dad was a landscaper, right? Which was typical for a man of his time. He was part of the 1940, 50s diaspora from Ireland. There were no jobs and they left. But it was very typical in my driveway, for people without status to be showing up asking my dad for work that day. And I say this all the time at NSC, because we act as if this is some like very, people without status, people coming here looking to escape X, you know, there's scars that you can see, there's scars that you can't see, right? There's economic, disparity, there's, just survival. And I'm really struck by that when I see productions like this, because, these are just human beings. Do you think anybody wants to put themselves through this? And that's what I sometimes you hear these other folks talk about, open borders and xenophobia and all this stuff. I mean, left side, right side, it doesn't matter. Like in my world at NSC, we see these people as human beings. They've got a story. Nobody wants to leave a place they love, right? Nobody. My parents never wanted to leave. They loved Ireland, but they could not survive there. They were so poor and they were so, and so I have the privilege of being able to connect my story to a story like this. Why would you leave a place you loved? You have to leave.
Right.
If you can't love the person you love, or if you've been, if you've endured some incredible torture. At NSC, we run a program for survivors of torture, and people don't really get that a lot of what's driving that is political torture or racial racial animus, you know, and on, religious-based torture. So I think not naming the countries was also very interesting for me, because again, it creates a space for us all to see ourselves in these people, in the actors and actresses, and certainly the characters they're portraying.
I think you really hit on something pretty profound about this play, among other plays that tackle issues in this, you know, in this arena. And I don't want to speak for Hannah Khalil, the playwright, but she and I spoke, and I asked her that question. I was like, why don't you give the characters names? Why don't you say what country they're from? And she basically said what you said, which is that the play has more resonance if it is flexible, right? Like, even though you learn at a certain point in the play that it takes place in England, even though we've given the actors have, you know, worked on dialects, the story feels more relatable if you're not like, oh, this is an immigration issue that happened in the UK in 2015. That's what we're talking about, right? You can't say it's not a problem here, and you can't distance yourself from it in a sort of like, well, I'm just watching the news happen, because the flexibility of the story becomes so universal. And I think it's very easy sometimes when we see plays with themes that are universal to be like, oh, it's universal. But the fact that people are kind of like distilled down to this very essence, and we don't spend a lot of time with each character, but we learn enough to like build an empathy with them, and we learn enough to create a context that actually we sort of fill in our minds in our own way. And that, I think that level of like imagination that the story asks for is actually really helpful, because we as empathetic humans actually connect ourselves more to them as a result than if we were told like, well, this is this character from this country who speaks this language and had this experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was something that we talked about when we were researching before we started our process, was who is detained at Yarlswood? Where are people coming from, and how is their detainment justified? And I would love to hear from both Michele and Margaret what your experience has been. Who's detained? Why are they there? Because Claire can say from the play, right, we have some characters who come from a country where homosexuality is illegal, or where there was extreme violence with buildings getting bombed. But I'd love to know what happens here.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same. Our clients come from all over the world, and they have all sorts of problems. I mean, I can tell you the clients who I represented who were in immigration detention range from a man who had fled Russia. He was a homosexual, a family from Iran that the woman was a political dissident and they had to flee. A family from Zimbabwe, a lot of families from Iraq, Syria. I mean, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and you know, people were fleeing for different reasons. Some women have fled because of domestic violence or forced marriage or female genital mutilation. People from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Often women are fleeing because of gang violence. Women being kind of identified as the wife of a gang leader, and you know, just kind of taken as a sex slave until they're able to flee and get out. And their parents, the only thing their parents can do to protect them is get them out of the country, because the gang is so embedded in the culture and in the government and in the political system that there's no way to escape unless you just get out of the country. I've represented a young man who was a child soldier. He was taken in Sierra Leone and taken as a child soldier and had to, you know, kind of fight at the front lines of a war. And the rebels put the kids at the front line because they don't want to be killed. So they go into villages, they kill all the parents, they kidnap all the kids, and then they make the children into child soldiers. I had a woman who was detained in the detention center, a young woman who had been a child soldier as well. So with the women, they make them fight at the front lines, and then at night, sometimes they're forced to service the men. And so it's really an incredible, there's a lot of trauma, a lot of tragedy. And, as Margaret said, people are fleeing because they have to. No one wants to get up in the middle of the night and leave the place that they love and leave the food that they love. I mean, I think that was another really touching part of this story, that conversation about food and how, something as basic as that is really important to kind of connect with your culture and connect with your past.
That is so interesting, Michele, because, well, first of all, before I forget, I want to mention, you mentioned every country of folks in our survivors of torture program, except for Mauritania. That's the only other one, but yeah, Eritrea, Syria, we see all sorts of things. But getting to the issue of food, which again was also very I just love the way that was introduced. We during the pandemic, so we serve again a lot of people. We realized that our folks were 2/3 of our formal clients are frontline workers. We knew it immediately that they were in trouble. And so we started to deliver food boxes that we got from Food Bank downtown, and it was Kraft mac and cheese and on and on. And I remember going into a room and saying, this is not going to work. And I know certainly from my culture, whenever things go, when my mom died a few months ago, I went to this shop that sells Irish sausage and bacon and beans and brown bread, and we had an Irish breakfast in honor of my mother. That's what you do when you're suffering. And so we realigned what we did, and we developed 5 culturally appropriate food boxes. Again, for the very reason you talked about, that matters. That small, especially during something so tragic like we're going through. And I'm not trying to take us off course, but these are people that have come here, they're seeking asylum, they're seeking refuge. And yeah, let's help them connect in that way so that they don't feel so isolated. And what's also striking to me about when you're watching the play, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not spending a lot of time at York and Berks, but I certainly hear that from what's happening from our folks. And we know that, Berks is certainly in a situation now where we hope it will stay that way in terms of being kind of shut down, but still staffed. But you wonder to yourself, why are we treating these folks like criminals? Right? They're coming here. They have a right to be, their case has a right to be heard. And yet the whole process has just become criminalized.
First things that I've been teaching at Villanova for a little bit more than 20 years. And one of the first things I did when I came here, I'd come from DC, I was invited to do a training through Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center, a training in the detention centers with the guards to train them about asylum and, asylum seekers. And it was so surprising that the vast majority of the guards at the time did not realize that the people who they were in charge of had not violated the criminal code. Like, they assumed they were in jail because they were criminals. And I was shocked because this training was the first time anyone had told them that people in immigration detention have not committed a crime. So they were being treated as if they had committed crimes. And that's the assumption, that they're criminals.
Yeah, it speaks to what you were all three mentioning about how immigrants are so often dehumanized, right? We take away their right to wear what they want, to eat what they want, to move freely, to have privacy. And we're left at this juncture where we have 2 people on the call who are getting their hands dirty with people. And then we have Claire who's saying, we need to amplify these stories. We need to make sure that no one is invisible when they're seeking help. And I think what's really special is that all three of you speak to how important it is to build a community around people who are being pushed out. And that's so important. That's so important.
Can I just dive in on one thing, Kate, that Margaret and Michelle mentioned? I think it was the food that made me think of it. I think one of the things this play does really beautifully too is marry this kind of balance of like the horrific and the mundane, right? Like half of these people's half of the story is just about them trying to survive in this place. It's about whether or not you can sleep, whether or not you can eat, whether or not you can get basic medical care. And then there are these moments where you're sort of reminded that these people have had, in some cases, horrific experiences. They're having horrific experiences within this detention center. And that scene, hopefully people watching this have seen it and I'm not giving anything away, but the scene where there's two detainees sort of discussing food while another detainee is being physically removed for deportation, I think strikes this balance of how we can have this kind of like cognitive dissonance within this world for these people, that you can live with this trauma in your life, you can live with the trauma that you're experiencing being detained, but also you can still be worried about having clothes to wear and having food to eat, and that those two things have to exist simultaneously.
You do.
I felt like that scene for me was really touching because for me it shows how hard it is to survive for immigrants in detention to survive, and how sometimes they themselves have to protect themselves because they're surrounded by all this re-traumatization that's happening to them and happening to others. And so they sat there talking about food in the face of this horrible thing and didn't turn around, because to me, if they turned around, they would have broken down. And so to keep their strength, they focused on something that was bringing them comfort, this reminder of their home, and basically couldn't see the humanity in their fellow detainee, because if they did, they themselves would have broken down. And I feel like that happens so, I think it goes to kind of the care that we need to give to ourselves and to the community when people do this type of work. I think we saw that also in the doctor, which we can talk about later. But
Yeah.
We can talk about that now. I would love to hear your perspectives on that scene, because yeesh.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in there because I've done some work in the detention centers with the medical teams, and I must say, like we had situations um, where clients were really sick, and the medical team in the detention center didn't pay enough attention to their illnesses. And sometimes then the clients had to be rushed out of the detention center because the staff in the center had let the condition go too far. I'm remembering this one client whose son, so she was in detention at Berks with her family, and her son had sickle cell anemia. And, she kept telling the medical staff that he needed special attention, and nobody was listening, to the point where he got, sent to a local hospital, and the doctors there were outraged because his temperature had risen so high, and the people in the facility hadn't, even been able to control his temperature. So there are issues like that. We also know of issues that people were, died in immigration detention. And then there's also the challenge of, as a lawyer, the stuff that was talked about in terms of scarring. Like, I need sometimes to bring in my own medical expert into the facility so that they can evaluate my client,
Hmm.
to document any scarring on his or her body. But oftentimes, I can't even get access to the detention center for my medical team. Like, I can have a medical evaluator who's willing to go to the detention center, but I have to negotiate with the detention center to get them in. And sometimes they won't even let them go in with equipment, but they won't let them borrow the equipment of the office. So it's such a challenge. Like, you kind of, you don't even realize these. It kind of goes back to what Claire was saying earlier, like the levels of challenges. Something that should be simple becomes like almost impossible when the client's in detention.
I was talking to Jonah, our asylum attorney, before the call today, and asked him about that scene in particular, and he said, that was spot on in terms of what we've experienced, and we work with the Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, Dr. Melissa Gutman at Penn, who's also got a network. So she's a psychiatrist, but she's got a network of other doctors that work with her on a pro bono basis to make sure that people are properly seen and actually seen and heard. So there's the physical scars, and then there's the emotional and mental health impact. And, it's just something that we take great care with, because it's certainly for building a case, but also just to recognize that, these centers aren't set up, right? They're set up to triage. They don't want to be hearing about, they're not here they don't want to take a story from someone or understand the significance of a, whatever event has brought them here seeking asylum. But yeah, that doctor, the portrayal of that doctor in particular was resonated with me pretty, in a very major way. I see kind of the human side of it, right? So, and remember, when we use the term asylum seeker, and I use the term refugee, I mean, these are all people just legally that, from an immigration law standpoint, they're one is the same. Michelle will explain all that to you, but essentially they're fleeing something. They're people fleeing something very bad. And some of them, refugees get status sooner because they work with the UNHCR and the US Refugee Assistance Program to find their way here. So they arrive with a little bit more status, and leverage, I would say, than a true asylum seeker who's found themselves, here in Philadelphia and is seeking status or asylum. But let me just say that, again, getting back to what we said originally, nobody wants to leave their country. Most of the people that we meet, I have this memory that's seared into my brain forever of a family from Syria. There was a window in time before, the election, the past election, and I'm not going to get into politics. I will not, promise. But in September of 2016, we were resettling a lot of Syrians because the doors had just opened and the Obama administration just, started to come in, and NSC in Philadelphia we were going to be one of the biggest resettlement agencies for Syrians arriving. And as you know, the war in Syria, as many wars around the world, is still going on, has been horrific and just decimated an extraordinarily beautiful and ancient culture. So I picked up a family at the airport. There was a mother and father. Some of the impact of the war and the fleeing to a Lebanese refugee camp to survive impacted the father such that he couldn't work. The mother, who was a Muslim, and in her culture would traditionally have been home caring for the kids and and building a beautiful life for them. She had 4 kids under 5. And so I say all this to say, I pick her up at the airport. I pick the family, myself and a colleague. He's an Arabic interpreter, so he tells us all this, and I will never, as long as I live, forget the look on her face. Right. So a lot of people feel like, well, people are just coming here and they just want to take all our stuff, and they just have no, absolutely no regard for the country, and they just want to take. And the look on her face when we arrived at the very modest apartment that we had rented for her through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, I mean, she was exhausted, she was terrified, and yet, like, the look of just absolute relief that a mother of four, who knew she would, by the way, would eventually teach herself to drive and become a line chef at one of Philadelphia's top restaurants, because Lebanese restaurants, because she makes a special kibbeh dish that no one else has tasted anything remotely as good. But just to see that journey from that first day to, like, last time I saw her, she wanted to give me a high five. I mean, like, it was just an amazing, not only transformation for her, because she dug deep and found the strength. She's contributed to our country in ways that are just unbelievably, meaningful. She creates community wherever she goes. And, sometimes I think to myself, I just wish I could, film her. Like, she taught herself to drive. Does anyone understand how radical that is for a young mother from Syria who didn't live in Damascus, was from the rural part of Syria? I mean, it's pretty awesome. And she did it because this is a country where, you got to take some risk. You got to take, you got to make the big ask and go for it. And she's doing that. And that's an American story.
Very American story. Very American. Are you going to follow up, Michele?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about kind of the challenges of being in detention. Actually, my first academic article that I ever wrote when I got the job at Villanova many years ago was on the costs of immigration detention, including the costs to the, not only like the fiscal kind of costs, but the costs to the individuals. But, one thing that's really important to think about is that most detention centers are not in major cities. And it's really hard for people who are in detention to get access to a low-cost lawyer. And basically, the statistics are really clear. Like, if you have access to an advocate, your likelihood of success on the merits of your case increases 10 times.
Wow.
So basically, like, only 5% of all the cases that where somebody is forced to represent themselves, they only win in 5% of cases. And so there are a lot of people who are in immigration detention who might have a valid reason for staying here. Like, under the law, they might be eligible to stay. But if they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the language, they certainly don't understand the law. Sometimes they don't even have an ability to communicate, effectively with a judge. And they're doing it all in the context of a litigation system that they're not familiar with. They don't have access to documents from their home country. They don't have access to research, and they're expected to present a case. And so, that's a huge cost, because our goal as a nation is to identify those people who are genuine asylum seekers and give them protection. Those are our obligations as a nation, as a signatory to international treaties. We have an obligation not to remove people who have suffered persecution or will suffer persecution in the future on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. So those are international treaty obligations that we've taken on as a nation, and yet, because of immigration detention, a lot of those genuine asylum seekers are not being identified. The other thing is that most asylum seekers have suffered some kind of physical or mental abuse or persecution, right? I mean, by the definition of an asylum seeker is someone who's either suffered past persecution or has a well-founded fear of future persecution. And in most cases, they've suffered past persecution. So what I find when working with my clients is that there's a lot of mental health related issues that arise when someone has suffered past persecution. So, you have nightmares, you get re-traumatized, you're suffering from PTSD. And all of that is happening in the context of being detained again in this country. And so being detained again re-traumatizes or makes it really hard for people to get beyond and move forward and not suffer from the mental health issues. And then on top of that, when people are in detention, they don't have access sometimes to religious services or be able to practice their religion. They can't, as we said earlier, they can't eat food. Sometimes the food disagrees with them, physically, like they can't digest the food, or they have problems, medical problems that arise from the food that's given to them in the detention center. The cultural difference, sometimes it's really hard even for the detainees to understand each other because they're coming from different cultures. We saw that in the play as well, right? That one woman who couldn't speak the language and how hard it was for her to interact with others. And then for children, there's an issue of education. So even if they're getting a quote unquote education in the detention center, usually it's not like age appropriate or language appropriate. It's just a minimal thing to kind of get by. So you think about like all the layers of issues that come with detention, which we could eliminate all of them if we just let people out of detention, because the statistics are very clear that if someone is released from detention and they have a valid asylum case, they're very, very likely to show up in court. So there's no reason to detain them. If you have a case, you're going to go to court. You want to become documented.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the crazy thing. And then, we haven't even spoken at all about privatization. Like most of the detention centers that house immigrants are privatized. So this is a profit center. And so once we continue to privatize, there's going to be financial corporate interests that care about keeping more people in detention.
Charleswood is actually also privately owned. Or privately managed by a security firm, right? Most people who end up in Yarlswood are released back into the community until their case is decided. So they might be there for a few months and then be sent back to, London, wherever they were living before. And Margaret, I think you were going to tag on there.
I just wanted to actually ask Michele about the one character, how interesting it was that essentially what would be in the US a dreamer, a DACA, wherever DACA is now, and that's a complicated story, but I'd just be interested on your take on that character and how it differs from what happens here in the States with someone in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, so what we're talking about are individuals who came to the United States, who were usually brought to the United States with a parent, or came to the United States when they were children. And they've lived here, gone to school here, integrated into society. A lot of people in this category, we refer to them sometimes as dreamers or DACA recipients. A lot of them don't even know that they don't have status in the United States until it comes to a point in their life where they have to be told, sometimes by their parents, or they find out, like if they're applying for college, they need to know what their status is, or if they apply for a driver's license. There's certain things when you become after high school where you might have to show that you have that you have status in the United States, and usually at that moment people realize or are told that they're undocumented. And in the United States, we have 700,000 individuals who are in this category, who speak English well, who were educated in our programs. Some of them don't speak the language of their parents' home country, like this story here. I think in the context in the United States, it's likely that people would be put into, that DACA recipients or dreamers would be put into detention if there was some kind of criminal issue that happened in their case. So they'd be brought to the attention of the federal government through some kind of criminal activity, even something as minor as driving under the influence, or even traffic violations in some cases.
Mhm.
And they could be put in detention and then put into removal proceedings.
Can I ask a quick question, just because I weirdly know more about these issues in the UK than I do in the US? The two detention centers that you both have referenced in the sort of greater Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, can you both share a little bit about them? Like, how many people are there? How long do people end up stuck there? Like, what are they? Give a little context on them?
Yeah, so the York County Jail is in York County, Pennsylvania, and it's a county jail. So it houses non-immigration detainees, but it also houses immigration detainees, and they're commingled. So the immigrants are detained in the same areas as the criminal detainees and treated pretty much the same. And it became such an industry that York County, similar to what Kate had said about England, York County ended up making a lot of money from the federal government to house immigration detainees. And it became so lucrative to them that for a period of time, at least the period that I was researching it, which is probably about 10 or more years ago now, York hadn't increased their local, like hadn't increased taxes for a long time because they were making so much money off of the detention center. And in the York County Detention Center, they've included an immigration court, which is attached to the jail. So there's an immigration court. So people who are in detention can appear in court without even going outside. It's just attached to the detention center at the end of one of the hallways. And so that facility houses men and women detainees. The women, there are fewer women there than men. And then the Burke's Family Shelter housed immigrant families. So if a parent came with a child, they would be detained in Berks County Detention Center, which is one of the only, like there are only a few family detention centers in the country, and Berks County had one of them. Margaret can share the good news.
So yeah, I'm on Monday. We got notice, as I'm sure you did, Michelle, that Burke's basically all the individuals that were detained there were let go. Now they've retained the staff. That's one thing our Jonah told me to make sure I got across, because he's been doing this for a long time. So he's like, the fact that the staff are still there, he's just going to keep an eye on it. But for the time being, we just know that they've been let go, and that there are other efforts that are taking place, I think, on the Texas border, again, to have a more sane and rational look at how we look at detention.
What was a big motivator for Berks being shut down, or rather having the detainees released? Was it COVID related?
No, it's been an active. There are some amazing activists, lawyers who are living in that area and others in the state. And there, for years, people have been protesting outside of Berks. And it's been a statewide effort for a long period of time. And it shows the dedication and commitment from just this, especially Bridget Cambria. Like there are some lawyers who work out in York who just made sure they worked tirelessly to make this happen.
Yeah.
It was really incredible.
That is really exciting to hear. It's very heartening to know how many people are ready to go to bat for folks who are just trying to find a better life for themselves.
I have another question about this. Sorry, I'm totally not trying to take over, Kate. I'm just like this. I have a lot of questions and I'm learning a lot. So, you know, Margaret, you talked about your parents immigrating from Ireland in the first half of the 20th century. You know, I have a family story about immigration in the 1800s. I feel like a lot of people do. What point did we start detaining people? What point did did our immigration and asylum system become like this? Or has it always been like this and we just don't get taught that in the history classes?
I mean, I think Michelle would know that better than I, but I can say that, you know, it's interesting for me right now because, as I said, NSC is turning 100. So we're going through, we just found out that there are 94 boxes in our archives at Temple University, and we're corralling history detectives to help us piece this together. But what we do know is that, right, xenophobia and hatred of the other is not a new thing. And everyone that now feels somewhat comfortable and safe in their cultural identity, I can assure you, you know, other than maybe, you know, a certain group that got here in the beginning, but outside of that, most people were, you know, ostracized, you know, lionized, felt made to feel like they were, they didn't belong here. And I know from my own experience, I have a cousin who, you know, in the Irish culture, the O apostrophe in my name means something. It's a very important thing, right? And my cousins dropped the O, just like many people from other countries just kept changing and, you know, modifying. Certainly, the Second World War, a lot of Jews fleeing the Nazis came here, and you know, everybody did their best to try to just fit in so they wouldn't be the next victim. And this goes on, this is on and on. You can go the Germans, the Hungarians. I mean, what I'm learning now, even about the last century, but I don't know when exactly, Michelle, it became, I know that as I said, people in my dad's driveway who had no status, you know, they would just pick them up and they'd send them back. There wasn't this industry that I know of was kind of brought up around that.
Yeah, and I could say that. So my research in 1996, before 1996, there were some hotels that were being used to detain immigrants. The responsibility at the time was put on the airline that had brought the person. So if someone came to the United States and was undocumented and found out on this side of the flight, then the airline was responsible for their custody. And in fact, those early clients that I represented, the Somalis, were held in in a detention center that was essentially a hotel near an airport that the airline managed. And then it really had, like, after 96, they started to use county jails. And then the industry has basically ballooned in the last, like, since 96. And you know, as I said, now it's becoming an industry, like a profit center for companies. And that is really alarming because the companies that own the detention centers, it's in their interest to make sure that their beds are being, you know, used. And so they even managed to legislate that a certain number of immigration beds have to be used every night. So they got legislation that there'll be, you know, enough people to maintain the bed quota nationwide. And so it's really, I've seen a huge development of this industry over the course of the years that I've been working in this field.
Thanks. I appreciate learning that because, yeah, I think that's the thing that, you know, in our research, which Kate did so beautifully, and in the process of looking at this play, we were all sort of aware of asylum and immigration, and of course, elements of America's history with xenophobia, but just the way this has turned into this very specific structure. And clearly there's a similar setup happening in the UK. I'm sure it's happening in other countries, right? Like this idea has taken off in different countries and are sort of modeling it similarly. But, facing the reality of what these detainment centers are like and how they function is something that I think maybe we're slightly more aware of in the news more recently in the past maybe 5 years with everything that's been going on. But before that, like I feel like your average layperson would not have really been aware.
Yeah, the thing I think also to think about, and Michelle, I could be wrong, but I mean, I mentioned before I worked for the Red Cross, and I was with the Red Cross after the World Trade Center or the 9/11 disaster. And, even the US Refugee Resettlement Program took a pause after that, took a look at its vetting. And then to President George W. Bush's credit, he did, he took that pause moment, and then he went and reactivated it, and the numbers went back up again. But the this hatred of the other, I think was again that's been here, or distrust. Let me just be kind and say distrust, or curiosity, or whatever it is. I think the introduction of a significant the narrative around Muslim majority countries and the impact of that on. Now, I'm not saying everyone in a detention center today is from a Muslim majority country. That's actually probably not true. But I will say that 2/3 of our survivors of torture clients are from Muslim countries. And it does appear that the issue of immigration, the fear of the immigrant, the concern that somehow they were not only coming and taking jobs, but altering, our way of being, our democracy, bringing Sharia law or whatever it is. That's definitely, I think, contributed to this feeling across the country that detention was even a viable option. Whereas, again, as we said before, these are people really just exercising a right that's part of international law and treaties that Michelle referenced earlier.
Exactly. Do you have any? Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I would just say that I think it's just fear of the other. And one thing that we need to do as a society is to encounter the immigrant, I think. And once people have personal experiences, and I think this play does a good job of helping us to humanize, right? And appreciate and hear the stories in the first person. And I think that's all very valuable. So thank you for the work you've done.
I love that you brought it back around to the play. Nice.
It's easy to wrap up.
Go ahead,
Claire.
Sorry. I do want to just the thing that, of course, my job in all of this is to think about the stories and think about the narratives and how this play can work against a lot of the narratives that we experience and those prejudices. And I think it's an interesting thing that, I keep going back to, like, Margaret, your story about your parents immigrating and how, like, that, it's not my family. And even from the outside, that's like a story of perseverance and courage and new opportunity. And it's the exact same thing you're describing with the family from Syria and the young mother who became a chef, right? Like, why do we celebrate that story for certain members of our community or our family, and then we don't celebrate it in the same way when it's really, like, it's the same story. And I think it goes back to that sort of refrain we keep coming back to, that universality, right? Like, that at some point I can't speak for everyone, but like at some point in my family's history, people left a difficult situation to make a better life in some capacity, right? Whatever that might be. I don't know what that situation is, or I have glimpses of what that situation is generations down. And, you know, a lot of people have that in America in particular, built into their sort of family narrative or their town's narrative or their community's narrative, and that we celebrate it for ourselves, but we don't celebrate it for others when you sort of miss the level of courage that it takes to step on that plane or that ship or whatever it is to come to America. I think we see it as about ourselves, but it's not. It's about that person. And I think what Hannah has done so beautifully in this play is put the story back in the hands of the person who literally had the courage to walk out the door and leave one day.
It really is spectacular to hear how many connections there are, because it makes me think, oh, we're all dealing with the same problems, which means when one place finds a good solution, we have a model. And we have, oh, cool, we've got NSC. Oh, we've got the CARES Clinic. This is great. There are solutions and there are ways to make things better. And it really is a pleasure to hear how we're making things better on the front lines, how we're using art to try and make things better. And I really wish we could all keep talking for another like 4 hours personally. So maybe in the future, right? But thank you all for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. What a privilege. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, of course, anytime. And we look forward to you seeing the full show because, you know, it hasn't been out yet. And in case you would like to learn more about the SCAR test, you can join us for our Speakers Night event, which is on Sunday, March 28th at 5 p.m. I'll be joined by playwright Hannah Khalil, director Claire Moyer, and artistic director at Villanova Theater, Michael Hollinger. This webinar will take place on Zoom, so you can find the link at villanovatheater.org. And we look forward to seeing you at the talkback. And thank you all so much for giving your time today to tell us all about immigration in the U.S.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.